The echo of gunshots still rang in her ears as Finley collapsed against the wooden post of the dilapidated barn. Blood seeped through her fingers where she clutched her side, but it was not her wound that threatened to overcome her, it was the exhaustion. 3 days of running, hiding, and fighting had drained whatever reserves of strength she once possessed. Now, as the Montana sunset painted the sky in violent shades of orange and crimson, she could feel her eyelids growing heavier with each labored breath. Montana Territory, 1876. A year that had begun with promise for Grace inheriting her father's modest ranch after his passing had quickly devolved into a nightmare when the neighboring Blackwater Mining Company decided her land contained something they wanted badly enough to kill for. "Miss, you still breathing?" The deep voice startled her, though she lacked the energy to even flinch. Through the haze of exhaustion, she made out the silhouette of a tall man framed in the barn doorway, his features obscured by the backlighting of the setting sun. "Stay back," Grace warned, her voice barely above a whisper as she fumbled for the revolver at her hip, only to find the holster empty. She'd used her last bullet 2 miles back. The stranger approached slowly, hands raised to show they were empty. "Not looking to hurt you, madam. Saw the blood trail leading to my barn. Thought I might offer help." As he drew closer, Grace could make out more details. The weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes, the dust-covered denim and leather that spoke of hard riding, and most importantly, the absence of the Blackwater Mining Company badge that had haunted her for days. "I'm Hank Forrester," he said, kneeling down beside her, careful to keep some distance. "You've picked a mighty isolated spot to bleed out." "Not by choice," Grace replied, wincing as she shifted. "Your barn, you say?" Hank nodded, his eyes gray as storm clouds assessing her wound with the practiced efficiency of someone familiar with injury. "Homestead's just over the ridge. You're about 20 miles from the nearest town." "Good," Grace murmured, her vision beginning to blur around the edges. "They won't look for me here." "Who won't?" Hank asked, reaching tentatively toward her bloodied side. But Grace couldn't answer. The combination of blood loss, exhaustion, and relief at finding temporary sanctuary overwhelmed her senses. Her eyes grew too heavy to keep open despite her desperate attempt to remain conscious. Hank must have noticed her struggle because his voice softened. "Sleep," the cowboy said. "I'll still be here when you wake." Those were the last words Grace heard before darkness claimed her. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. First, the crackling of a fire. Then, the soft weight of blankets against her skin. Finally, the dull ache in her side that pulsed with each heartbeat. Grace opened her eyes to find herself in a modest cabin. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn log walls. She was lying on a narrow bed, dressed in an oversized shirt that wasn't hers, her side carefully bandaged. "Welcome back," came a now familiar voice. She turned her head to find Hank Forrester seated in a rocking chair nearby, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. "How long?" Grace asked, her throat parched. "Almost 2 days," Hank replied, setting aside his carving to pour water from a pitcher into a tin cup. He rose and brought it to her, supporting her head as she drank greedily. "You were in pretty bad shape. Bullet just grazed you, but infection was setting in. Lucky I keep a good supply of medicinals." Grace sank back into the pillow, studying her unlikely savior more carefully now. In the firelight, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 to her 24 years. His face was tanned and weathered from life outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into a neatly trimmed beard that was the same rich brown as his hair. "Why help me?" Grace asked, the question that had been nagging at her since she'd awoken. Hank returned to his chair, picking up his whittling knife again. "Could ask why you were being chased, bleeding, and near dead on my property. But my pa taught me to help first, ask questions later." "They killed my father," Grace said after a long silence. "And they'll kill me too if they find me." Hank's knife paused mid-stroke. "Blackwater," Grace's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Been pushing folks off their land up and down this territory for years now. They came for my neighbor last spring. Old man Jeffers refused to sell. Week later, his place burned down with him in it. Accident, they called it." Hank's voice had hardened. They want the copper under my land, Grace explained, feeling a strange relief at being able to speak the truth. My father refused their offers. Said the ranch had been in our family too long to give up. 3 weeks ago, I found him shot in the back while checking fences. Sheriff who's in Blackwater's pocket called it a tragic mishap, probably Indians. The next day, their men came with papers saying my father had sold before his accident. When I contested it, they decided it would be easier if I had an accident too. Hank nodded grimly. You can stay here until you're healed up. Blackwater doesn't know about this place. I keep to myself. I can't impose. Grace started to protest. You got somewhere better to go? Hank interrupted. Grace fell silent. She had no family left, no allies she could trust. Her ranch was now crawling with Blackwater men. She was, in every sense, alone. Thought as much, Hank said, returning to his whittling. Rest now. We'll figure out next steps when you're stronger. Over the next few days, Grace's strength slowly returned. Hank proved to be a surprisingly skilled nurse, changing her bandages, preparing simple but nourishing meals, and giving her space when she needed it. He never pressed her for more details about her situation, seeming content to let her share in her own time. Grace learned that Hank had come to Montana 5 years earlier after serving as a scout for the Army. He'd built his cabin and barn himself, raising a small herd of horses that he trained and sold. He lived completely self-sufficiently, making infrequent trips to town only when absolutely necessary. Didn't you get lonely? Grace asked him one evening as they sat by the fire, she now well enough to sit in a chair wrapped in blankets. Hank considered the question longer than seemed necessary. Got used to my own company during the war. Afterwards, found most people weren't worth the trouble they brought. He paused, glancing at her with the hint of a smile. Present company accepted, of course. I'm nothing but trouble, Grace replied, not entirely joking. Trouble finds everyone eventually, Miss Finley. At least yours isn't self-made. A week after her arrival, Grace was able to stand and walk short distances. Hank supported her as she took her first steps outside the cabin, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs and bringing color to her cheeks. It's beautiful here, she said, taking in the vista of rolling hills, the distant mountains still capped with snow despite the season. That's why I chose it, Hank replied. No one to bother me, and views that make the solitude worthwhile. As they stood together, Grace became acutely aware of his arm around her waist, steadying her. The closeness stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time, perhaps had never truly felt before. It was unexpected and, given her circumstances, entirely inappropriate. She pulled away abruptly. I should be strong enough to leave in a few days, she announced. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Something flashed in Hank's eyes, disappointment, perhaps? But it was gone so quickly Grace thought she might have imagined it. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, he said neutrally. Blackwater has a long memory. I can't hide forever. No, he agreed. But you can recover properly before you decide what's next. That night, as Grace lay awake in the bed Hank had insisted she keep while he slept on a pallet near the fire, she contemplated her limited options. She had some money sewn into the lining of her jacket, enough perhaps to get her to California or Oregon, somewhere beyond Blackwater's reach. But the thought of starting over alone in a strange place filled her with dread. More troubling was the realization that the prospect of leaving Hank's homestead caused an unexpected ache in her chest. In just over a week, his quiet presence had become a comfort she wasn't ready to relinquish. The next morning, Grace awoke to find the cabin empty. A note on the table informed her that Hank had gone to check his trap lines and would return by midday. Feeling stronger than she had in days, Grace decided to make herself useful. She heated water and washed the dishes that had accumulated, swept the rough wooden floors, and even attempted to prepare a stew with the vegetables she found in Hank's root cellar. She was so absorbed in her tasks that she didn't hear the approaching horses until they were nearly at the cabin. Panic seized her as she peered through the window to see 3 men dismounting, all wearing the distinctive Blackwater Mining Company badges on their vests. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she frantically looked around for somewhere to hide or a weapon to defend herself. She spotted Hank's rifle mounted above the fireplace, but knew she would never reach it before the men entered. Instead, she grabbed a kitchen knife and slipped into the small pantry just as the first knock came at the door. Hello? "Anyone home?" A gruff voice called out. The door creaked open. "Check the barn," the same voice ordered. "Johnson, look around in here." Grace pressed herself against the wall of the pantry, knife clutched to her chest, as footsteps moved around the cabin. She could smell the stew she'd left simmering on the stove. "Someone's been here recently," one of the men said. "Food's still cooking. Might be that Trapper Winchester mentioned seeing up this way. Keep looking." The footsteps drew nearer to the pantry. Grace held her breath, preparing to strike if the door opened. Just then, she heard a commotion outside. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Hank's voice boomed. The footsteps in the cabin retreated quickly. Grace pressed her ear to the pantry door, straining to hear. "Easy there, mister," the gruff voice responded. "We're just looking for a fugitive." "Young woman, shot one of our men before fleeing. Dangerous criminal. Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Hank replied coldly. "Now, I'll ask once more, what are you doing in my home without permission? We have authority throughout the territory, not on private property without cause," Hank interrupted. "I was a deputy marshal before I came here. I know the law better than you do." There was a tense silence before the gruff voice spoke again. "No need for trouble. We'll be on our way. But if you see this woman, Grace Finley, you're obligated to report it." "I report to no one," Hank stated flatly. "Especially not company men playing at being lawmen. Now get off my land." Grace heard the men mounting their horses, muttering among themselves. Once she was certain they had ridden a safe distance away, she emerged from the pantry to find Hank standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, watching them disappear over the ridge. "They're gone," he said without turning around. For now, Grace sagged against the table, the knife still clutched in her trembling hand. "They know I'm in the area. They won't stop looking." Hank closed the door and crossed to her, gently taking the knife from her grip. "Good thing I found those tracks when I did. They led me straight here instead of checking my trap lines." "How did you know they were Blackwater?" Grace asked. "Recognized their horses. They've been asking questions at all the homesteads within 50 miles of your place." Hank placed the rifle back on its hooks above the fireplace. "Made the stew, did you?" The abrupt change of subject startled Grace. "Ah, yes. I wanted to thank you somehow." A small smile crossed Hank's face. "Smells good." "Better than my cooking, I'd wager." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "Did you not hear me? They're looking for me. They'll come back." "Probably," Hank agreed, stirring the stew and tasting it approvingly. "But not right away. They'll check other places first." He turned to face her, his expression serious now. "Which gives us time to plan." "Plan what?" Grace asked, confusion evident in her voice. "How to get your ranch back." Grace shook her head in disbelief. "That's impossible. Blackwater is too powerful. They have men, money, and the law on their side." "They think they do," Hank corrected her. "But they've made a mistake." "What mistake?" "They've made too many enemies." Hank gestured for her to sit at the table. "There are others like you, Grace. People who've lost homes, loved ones to Blackwater's greed. We've just never had a reason to stand together before." Grace sat down heavily, her mind racing. "You're talking about fighting back? That's suicide." "Not fighting. Not directly." Hank served 2 bowls of stew and placed one before her. "Eat. You'll need your strength. I've been thinking about this since you arrived." As they ate, Hank laid out his thoughts. The territorial governor was due to visit the county seat in 3 weeks' time. Blackwater had been operating with impunity because local officials were in their pocket, but the governor wasn't, at least not completely. If they could gather enough evidence of Blackwater's illegal activities and present it directly to the governor, along with testimonies from multiple victims, they might force an official investigation. "And where would we get this evidence?" Grace asked, skeptical despite the tiny spark of hope beginning to flicker within her. "I have some ideas about that," Hank replied. "Starting tomorrow, I'm going to visit some old acquaintances. People who've been hurt by Blackwater, like you. While I stay hidden here." Grace couldn't keep the frustration from her voice. Hank's gaze was steady. "For now, you're still healing. Besides, you're the one they're actively hunting. But you won't be idle." He rose and retrieved a journal from a shelf. "I need you to write down everything: dates, names, what happened to your father, the falsified sale. Every detail you can remember." As Grace looked at the leather-bound journal Hank placed before her, she realized he was offering something she'd thought lost forever, a chance to fight back, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. More than that, he was offering an alliance when she'd believed herself completely alone. Why? She asked, looking up at him. Why help me? You don't even know me. Hank was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. Maybe I want to know you, he finally said, his voice softer than she'd heard before. Maybe I'm tired of watching Blackwater destroy good people. Or maybe I just don't like bullies. With that, he stood and began clearing the dishes, leaving Grace to contemplate the journal and the unexpected turn her desperate flight had taken. The next morning, Hank prepared to leave on the first of his recruitment missions. He'd explained that he would be gone for 3 days, visiting former neighbors who'd been driven off their land but remained in the area. If Blackwater men return, hide in the root cellar, he instructed as he saddled his horse. There's a false wall at the back. Food, water, and ammunition are stored there. Grace nodded, trying to hide her anxiety of being left alone. The encounter with the Blackwater men had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Be careful, she said. They're dangerous. Hank checked his saddle cinch one last time before turning to face her. So am I, when I need to be. There was something in his eyes that reminded Grace he had once been a soldier, had survived conflicts she could only imagine. Before mounting, Hank hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a revolver, offering it to her. It was my mother's. She was a better shot than my father. Grace took the weapon, feeling its comfortable weight in her palm. Thank you. I'll be back as soon as I can, Hank promised, swinging into the saddle. Keep writing in that journal. The more detailed your account, the better our chances. As she watched him ride away, Grace felt a conflicting mix of emotions: fear at being left alone, determination to document her story, and an unexpected longing for Hank's return that went beyond simple concern for her safety. The days of Hank's absence passed slowly. Grace divided her time between writing in the journal, regaining her strength with short walks around the property, and learning the layout of Hank's homestead. She discovered he was more of a reader than she'd expected, with a small but carefully curated collection of books ranging from practical manuals on farming and horse training to dog-eared volumes of poetry and philosophy. On the third day, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain and wind that howled through the cabin's eaves. As darkness fell with no sign of Hank, Grace grew increasingly worried. She paced by the window, peering out into the gloom, watching for any movement on the trail leading to the cabin. Finally, well past midnight, she heard hoofbeats approaching through the downpour. Grabbing the revolver, Grace positioned herself by the door, ready for trouble. Relief flooded through her when Hank's familiar silhouette appeared, though it was quickly replaced by concern when she saw he was slumped forward in the saddle. Grace rushed out into the ring. Hank, he raised his head with visible effort. Got into some trouble, he managed, his voice strained. Blackwater had men watching the Jefferson place. With Grace's help, Hank dismounted and staggered into the cabin. His shirt was torn and bloodied along his left shoulder, and a nasty bruise was forming on his jaw. Sit, Grace ordered, guiding him to a chair. While he caught his breath, she stoked the fire and put water on to boil. What happened? Thought I was being careful. Hank grimaced as Grace helped him remove his sodden jacket and shirt. But they must have been watching Old Man Jefferson's place. Jumped me as I was leaving. 3 of them. Grace examined the wound on his shoulder, a deep gash that would need stitching. And yet you're the only one who made it back, she observed, noting the bloodied knife still in his belt. A grim smile crossed Hank's face. Like I said, I can be dangerous when needed. One's dead. The others won't be following anytime soon. As Grace cleaned and stitched Hank's wound, a task her father had taught her years ago when their ranch was too remote for regular doctor visits, she felt a shift in their relationship. The roles of protector and protected had blurred. They were now truly allies, both wounded by the same enemy, both fighting for survival. Did you at least speak with Jefferson before you were ambushed? Grace asked as she tied off the final stitch. Hank nodded, wincing slightly as she applied a salve to the freshly closed wound. Him and 2 others. They're willing to testify. Each had land seized through forged documents after refusing to sell. So we have witnesses, Grace said, a spark of hope kindling within her. More than witnesses, Hank replied, reaching into his boot and pulling out a folded document. Jefferson kept the original deed to his property, the one Blackwater claimed he'd signed over. The signature is clearly forged. And look here. He pointed to a name at the bottom of the page. Witness to the transaction, Judge Harmon Crawford. Grace's eyes widened. The county judge? He's involved. Up to his neck, Hank confirmed. That's why no one could get justice through the courts. But the territorial governor appointed Crawford. If we can prove he's corrupt, the governor will have no choice but to act. As Hank spoke, his exhaustion became increasingly evident. His words began to slur, and his eyelids grew heavy. The combination of his injury, the fight, and the long ride home in the storm had drained whatever reserves of energy he possessed. You need to rest, Grace said softly, helping him to the bed her bed for the past weeks. I'll take the pallet, Hank protested weakly. Not with that shoulder, Grace insisted. I've kept you from your own bed long enough. Too exhausted to argue further, Hank allowed her to help him lie down. As she pulled the blanket over him, his hand caught hers. We're making progress, Grace, he murmured, his eyes already closing. We'll get your ranch back. Grace watched as sleep claimed him, her hand still captured in his. Our fight, she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Not just mine anymore. In the days that followed, their roles reversed completely. Grace became the caretaker, tending to Hank's wound, preparing meals, and taking over the daily chores of the homestead. The physical activity accelerated her own recovery, and for the first time since her father's murder, she felt a sense of purpose. Hank, for his part, was a terrible patient, restless and determined to push his recovery faster than was wise. His stubborn insistence on helping with chores often resulted in reopening his wound, much to Grace's exasperation. You're the most hard-headed man I've ever met, she scolded after finding him attempting to split firewood 3 days after his return. That shoulder will never heal if you keep tearing my stitches. Hank leaned on the axe, his face pale but determined. Winter's coming. We need wood. And I need you alive and with both arms functional if we're going to take on Blackwater, Grace countered, taking the axe from his hands. Now go sit down before you fall down. To her surprise, Hank obeyed, watching with evident admiration as she finished the job he'd started, her strokes with the axe precise and powerful. Where did you learn to handle an axe like that? He asked as she stacked the split wood. My mother died when I was 8, Grace explained, pausing in her work. My father didn't have the luxury of treating me like some delicate flower. He taught me everything he knew: how to run the ranch, how to hunt, how to defend myself. A sad smile crossed her face. He always said I was stronger than any son he could have wished for. Smart man, Hank observed quietly. Their forced proximity as Hank recovered changed the dynamic between them. Conversations that had once been cautious and limited to practical matters now extended into the night, ranging from their respective pasts to their hopes for the future. Grace learned that Hank had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, and had joined the Union Army at 17, lying about his age. After the war, finding home changed beyond recognition. He'd headed west, working as a scout, a ranch hand, and briefly as a deputy marshal before deciding solitude suited him best. Until now. Grace observed one evening as they sat by the fire, Hank whittling a new piece while she mended one of his shirts. Hank's hand stilled. What do you mean? You chose solitude, yet here you are, not only taking in a stranger, but planning to gather a group to take on the most powerful company in the territory. Grace set aside her mending. That doesn't sound like someone who prefers to be alone. Hank was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, maybe I just needed the right reason to change my mind. The look he gave her sent warmth flooding through Grace that had nothing to do with the fire before them. She felt a pull toward him that both frightened and exhilarated her, a connection that had been building since that first day when she'd collapsed in his barn. Before either could act on the tension between them, however, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Grace immediately reached for the revolver Hank had given her, while Hank, despite his injured shoulder, grabbed his rifle. Root cellar, he whispered urgently. Now. I'm not hiding while you face them alone, Grace hissed back. Not this time. Hank looked like he wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in her eyes. Stay behind me. Then, he conceded, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. After a tense moment, his shoulders relaxed slightly. It's Jefferson, he said with evident relief. And looks like the Taylor brothers with him. Grace lowered her revolver as Hank opened the door to admit 3 rain-soaked men. Jacob Jefferson was an older man with a weathered face and a shock of white hair. The Taylor brothers, Elias and Samuel, were younger, perhaps in their 30s, with the muscular builds of men accustomed to hard physical labor. "Sorry to arrive unannounced," Jefferson said as he removed his dripping hat. "But there's been developments." Over coffee laced with whiskey, the men shared their news. Blackwater had escalated their tactics throughout the territory. More homesteaders had been threatened, and rumors were circulating about a large copper deposit recently discovered, one that supposedly extended under multiple properties, including Grace's ranch. "They're getting desperate," Elias Taylor explained. "Word is, they've promised investors back east they'd have the land secured by year's end." "The governor's visit is our only chance," Samuel added grimly. "But Blackwater knows it too. They're watching all the roads to the county seat." Hank absorbed this information in silence, his expression thoughtful. "Then we don't all go together," he finally said. "Jefferson, you and Grace take the evidence directly to the governor. The Taylor brothers and I will gather the other witnesses and bring them by different routes." The men nodded in agreement, but Grace interjected, "I'm not leaving you." "It makes the most sense," Hank insisted. "You're the most recent victim. Your testimony is the strongest, and Jefferson has the forged deed with Crawford's signature. Together, you have the best chance of convincing the governor." Grace wanted to argue, but recognized the logic in his plan. Still, the thought of separating after all they'd been through filled her with dread. The men stayed the night, sleeping on the cabin floor while Grace took the pallet and Hank insisted on keeping watch despite his injury. Before dawn, they departed, agreeing to reconvene in 1 week's time at the county seat, the day before the governor's scheduled arrival. Once they were alone again, Grace turned to Hank. "I don't like this plan," she admitted. "Separating feels like walking into a trap." Hank crossed to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I don't like it either," he confessed. "But it gives us the best chance of success. Too many people have suffered under Blackwater's greed. This might be our only opportunity to stop them." Grace looked up into his face, noticing how the early morning light accentuated the angles of his features. "When did this become so important to you?" she asked softly. "This was my fight. It became my fight the moment you collapsed in my barn," Hank replied, his voice equally soft. Then, with a hint of his usual wryness, he added, "Besides, I've never been good at walking away from trouble." Grace couldn't help but smile. "So I'm trouble now?" "The best kind," Hank murmured, and before Grace could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, as if he expected her to pull away. But Grace found herself responding with a fervor that surprised them both. All the tension, fear, and unspoken feelings of the past weeks poured into that connection, transforming it from a simple expression of affection into something far more profound. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since you started bossing me around during my recovery," he admitted with a small smile. Grace laughed softly. "And I've been wanting you to since the day you told those Blackwater men to get off your land." The admission changed something between them, solidifying the partnership that had been forming since her arrival. That night, for the first time, they shared the narrow bed, Grace careful of Hank's injured shoulder as she curled against him, finding a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her father's murder. In the quiet darkness, Hank whispered, "When this is over, when you have your ranch back, what then?" Grace considered the question, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "The ranch was my father's dream more than mine. I loved it because he did." "And what's your dream?" Hank asked, his voice soft in the darkness. Grace was silent for a long moment. "I never allowed myself to think beyond the next day, the next season. The ranch consumed everything." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What about you? Will you go back to your solitude when this is over?" In the dim light, she could see Hank smile. "I'm beginning to think solitude is overrated." The week of preparation passed quickly. Grace and Hank spent the days gathering supplies, studying maps, and planning alternate routes to the county seat. At night, they found solace in each other's arms, their growing intimacy a beacon of hope amid the dangerous uncertainty of their mission. The evening before they were to depart, Grace found Hank standing on the porch, staring out at the mountains silhouetted against the sunset sky. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, joining him. Hank shook his head, "Just appreciating the view. Never know when you might see your last sunset." "That's cheerful," Grace remarked, though she understood his meaning all too well. Hank turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Grace, if something happens to me, don't," she interrupted, pulling her hands free. "Nothing is going to happen to either of us." "I need to say this," Hank insisted, recapturing one of her hands. "If something happens, the deed to this place is in my strongbox under the floorboards by the hearth. It's yours if you want it." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "You're giving me your home?" "I'm giving you options," Hank clarified. "Whatever happens with Blackwater, with your ranch, I want you to know you have a place that's yours. No one can take it from you." Tears welled in Grace's eyes at the unexpected gesture. No one had offered her such security, such care, since her father's death. "I don't want your home without you in it," she whispered fiercely. Hank's expression softened as he pulled her close. "Well then, I'll just have to make sure I come back, won't I?" The journey to the county seat was tense, but uneventful. Grace traveled with Jefferson as planned, while Hank departed separately to gather the remaining witnesses. The rendezvous was set for the following evening at a small boarding house on the outskirts of town where the owner, a widow named Mrs. Holbrook, had lost her husband to a suspicious accident after refusing Blackwater's offer for their property. Grace and Jefferson arrived first, carefully avoiding the main streets where Blackwater men might be watching. Mrs. Holbrook ushered them into a back room where they could rest and prepare their testimony for the governor's arrival the next day. "Has there been any word from the others?" Grace asked anxiously. Mrs. Holbrook shook her head. "Not yet, dear. But the roads are busy with people coming for the governor's visit. They'll blend in with the crowds." As the hours passed with no sign of Hank or the others, Grace's anxiety grew. She paced the small room, periodically peering out the window for any familiar faces among the townsfolk filling the streets. "He'll come," Jefferson assured her, noticing her distress. "Forrester's a careful man. Won't move until he's sure it's safe." But when darkness fell with still no word, even Jefferson began to look concerned. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "The Taylor boys should have been here by now, at least." Just as Grace was preparing to go looking for them, a foolhardy plan she knew, but she couldn't bear the waiting any longer. The back door opened, and Mrs. Holbrook hurried in, her face pale. "You need to leave," she whispered urgently. "Now?" "Blackwater men are searching every boarding house in town. Someone must have talked." "But Hank," Grace began. "No time," Mrs. Holbrook interrupted, already gathering their belongings. "There's a cellar under the stable out back. You can hide there until morning." Jefferson grabbed the satchel containing the evidence they'd gathered and followed Mrs. Holbrook without hesitation. Grace lingered, torn between the need to hide and her desperate worry for Hank. "He would want you safe," Mrs. Holbrook said gently, seeing her indecision. "If he comes, I'll send him to you. Now hurry." Reluctantly, Grace followed them out into the night. They had just reached the stable when shouts erupted from the direction of the boarding house. Blackwater men had arrived. The cellar was small and damp, with only a single lantern that Jefferson lit once Mrs. Holbrook had closed the trapdoor above them. Grace huddled in the corner, listening to the muffled sounds of men searching the property above. "They won't find us here," Jefferson whispered reassuringly. "This place was built during the Indian troubles. Hidden storage for valuables." Grace nodded, though she took little comfort from his words. Her thoughts were with Hank. Had he been captured? Was he even now being forced to reveal their location? Or worse, had the Blackwater men decided questioning was unnecessary? The night passed with agonizing slowness. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear, and Grace drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with images of Hank wounded and alone, calling her name. She awoke to the sound of the trapdoor opening. Immediately alert, Grace reached for the revolver at her side, prepared to fight if necessary. But it was Mrs. Holbrook's weathered face that appeared in the opening. "They're gone," the older woman reported. "Searched the whole place and moved on. But there's news in town, bad news. There was a shootout at Miller's Creek Crossing last night. They're saying some of Blackwater's men were killed. Grace's heart seemed to stop. Miller's Creek was on the route Hank would have taken. Any word on who else was involved? She asked, her voice barely steady. Mrs. Holbrook shook her head. Just rumors. But the governor's still coming. He's due at the courthouse at noon. Jefferson helped Grace up through the trapdoor. We need to proceed as planned, he said firmly. With or without the others. This might be our only chance. Grace wanted to protest, to insist they wait for Hank, but she knew Jefferson was right. They had come too far, risked too much, to turn back now. The evidence they carried could end Blackwater's reign of terror throughout the territory. We'll go, she agreed. But separately, in case they're watching for us. I'll meet you at the courthouse steps at 11:30. After cleaning up as best she could, Grace borrowed a shawl from Mrs. Holbrook and ventured into the town. The streets were crowded with people eager to see the governor, making it easier for her to move about undetected. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize her. As she neared the courthouse, Grace spotted several Blackwater men stationed around the perimeter. Her heart sank. Getting past them to reach the governor would be nearly impossible. Then, through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, Samuel Taylor, one of the brothers who had been traveling with Hank. He was standing near a side entrance to the courthouse, looking anxious but unharmed. Hope surging, Grace made her way toward him, careful to approach from an angle where the Blackwater men wouldn't notice. Samuel, she whispered when she was close enough. Where's Hank? What happened at Miller's Creek? Samuel's eyes widened in recognition. Grace, thank God. We thought you might have been caught. He glanced around nervously before continuing. Ambush at the creek. Blackwater had at least 10 men waiting. Hank sensed something was wrong, sent me ahead while he and Elias created a distraction. Are they? Grace couldn't bring herself to finish the question. Elias took a bullet in the leg, but he'll live. He's hiding at Doc Wilson's place. The doc's no friend of Blackwater. And Hank? Grace pressed, dreading the answer. Samuel's expression was grim. I don't know. There was shooting, a lot of it. I saw him take down at least 3 of them, but then I had to run. Blackwater men were everywhere. Grace's world seemed to tilt beneath her. The thought of Hank lying wounded or worse alone at Miller's Creek was unbearable. I have to find him, she said, already turning away. Samuel caught her arm. No, the governor will be here any minute. This is what we've been fighting for. Hank would want you to see it through. The internal struggle nearly tore Grace apart. Every instinct screamed for her to go to Hank, to search for him until she found him. But she knew Samuel was right. If she abandoned their plan now, Hank's sacrifice, whatever it might have been, would be for nothing. I'll stay, she said finally. But as soon as we've spoken to the governor, I'm going to find him. Jefferson joined them moments later, and together they positioned themselves near the courthouse steps, waiting for the governor's arrival. The crowd's excitement grew as noon approached, people pressing forward for a better view. At precisely 12 o'clock, a procession of carriages turned onto the main street. The crowd cheered as the governor, a distinguished man in his 60s, emerged from the lead carriage and began ascending the courthouse steps, flanked by aides and local officials. Grace saw Judge Crawford among them, his face a mask of civic pride that turned her stomach. This was the man who had helped steal her father's land, who had likely signed the orders for her own death. Now, Jefferson muttered, pushing forward through the crowd. Grace followed, her heart pounding as they approached the governor's party. One of the aides moved to intercept them, but Jefferson called out loudly, Governor Williams, we have evidence of corruption and murder committed by the Blackwater Mining Company. The crowd hushed at this pronouncement, all eyes turning toward them. The governor paused on the steps, clearly surprised by the interruption. Judge Crawford's face had gone pale. What is the meaning of this? Governor Williams demanded, though he motioned for his aide to let them approach. My name is Jacob Jefferson, Jefferson began. This is Grace Finley. We represent a group of homesteaders who have had their land stolen through forgery and violence perpetrated by the Blackwater Mining Company, with the collusion of county officials. The governor's gaze sharpened. Those are serious allegations, Mr. Jefferson. We have proof, Grace interjected, stepping forward and opening the satchel to retrieve the documents they'd gathered, including forged deeds bearing Judge Crawford's signature as witness. Crawford sputtered indignantly. This is preposterous. These people are clearly deranged. Let me see these documents. The governor interrupted, holding out his hand. As Grace moved to hand over the evidence, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Blackwater men were pushing their way toward them, guns drawn. "Stop them," one of them shouted. "They're wanted criminals." The governor's guards immediately moved to protect him, drawing their own weapons. The crowd began to panic, people shoving in their haste to get away from the potential violence. In the chaos, Grace lost her grip on the satchel. Documents spilled across the courthouse steps as she was jostled by the fleeing crowd. Desperately, she dropped to her knees, trying to gather the scattered papers before they could be trampled or blown away. A gunshot rang out, followed by screams from the crowd. Grace looked up to see one of the Blackwater men fall, revealing a figure behind him that made her heart leap. Hank, bloodied but very much alive, his rifle still raised. "Governor Williams," he called out, his voice carrying across the now quieting square. "My name is Hank Forrester, former Deputy U.S. Marshal. I can confirm everything Miss Finley and Mr. Jefferson have told you. Blackwater Mining has been terrorizing this territory for years." The governor, who had been hustled to safety by his guards, reappeared at the top of the steps. "Marshal Forrester," he acknowledged with evident recognition, "your reputation precedes you." What followed was a flurry of activity that seemed to Grace both chaotic and precisely orchestrated. The governor ordered his personal guard to secure the Blackwater men, including Judge Crawford, who was attempting to slip away unnoticed. Officials were dispatched to collect Elias Taylor and the other witnesses. An impromptu hearing was convened in the courthouse, where one by one, the victims of Blackwater's greed and violence told their stories. Through it all, Grace remained by Hank's side, barely believing he was really there. He had a bullet graze along his temple and moved stiffly, suggesting other injuries he was hiding, but his eyes were clear and determined as he presented his own testimony. By evening, Governor Williams had heard enough. He ordered the immediate arrest of Judge Crawford and the Blackwater officials present in town. He issued a temporary injunction freezing all Blackwater operations in the territory pending a full investigation. And most importantly to Grace, he officially nullified all land transfers involving Blackwater Mining Company until their legitimacy could be verified. "You've done a service to this territory today," the governor told them as the hearing concluded. "It will take time to unravel all of Blackwater's misdeeds, but justice will be served." As they left the courthouse, Grace felt a strange lightness, as if a weight she'd carried for months had suddenly been lifted. Her ranch wasn't yet restored to her that would require more legal proceedings, but for the first time, she believed it was possible. "You came back," she said to Hank as they walked slowly toward Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house. "I thought, when I heard about Miller's Creek." Hank took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Told you I would." Grace studied his face in the fading light, noting the new lines of exhaustion, the darkening bruise at his temple. "What happened?" "Blackwater had more men than we expected," Hank explained. "Elias and I held them off long enough for Samuel to get away with the witness testimonies. Then we split up. I doubled back through Sawyer's Ridge, added a day to the journey, but avoided their patrols. And you arrived just in time," Grace observed, remembering the moment she'd seen him in the crowd, like some avenging angel. Hank smiled wryly. "Nearly wasn't. Saw the commotion from across town, had to run the last half mile." His expression grew serious. "When I couldn't find you at Mrs. Holbrook's, I feared the worst." They had reached the boarding house, but instead of going inside, Grace led Hank to a small garden bench in the yard. Her mind was swirling with emotions and questions about what would come next. "My ranch," she began hesitantly. "It's going to take time to get it back properly." "Yes," Hank agreed. "But the governor's on our side now. It will happen." Grace took a deep breath. "When it does, I've been thinking about what you asked about what I really want." Hank watched her face carefully, waiting. "The ranch was my father's dream," Grace continued. "I loved it because it was his legacy to me. But if I'm honest with myself, what I want is something of my own making." She met his gaze directly. "Something we could build together, perhaps." The hope that dawned in Hank's eyes gave her courage to continue. "Your homestead is beautiful," she said. "Remote, peaceful. Room for more horses, maybe even a few cattle. Room to grow." She faltered slightly. "If that's something you might want to." Hank reached out, cupping her face in his calloused hand. Grace Finley, I've been alone most of my life by choice. Never met anyone who made me question that choice until you collapsed in my barn. His thumb traced her cheekbone gently. Now I can't imagine going back to the quiet. Is that a yes? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's more than a yes, Hank replied, leaning forward until their foreheads touched. It's a promise. Whatever you decide about your ranch, keep it. Sell it. My home is yours now. Has been since the moment you walked in. As twilight deepened around them, Grace closed the remaining distance between them, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all they had endured and all they hoped to build. 3 months later, as winter settled over the Montana territory, Grace stood on the porch of what was now their cabin, watching as Hank worked with a young colt in the corral below. The legal proceedings regarding her father's ranch were still ongoing, but the governor had been true to his word. Blackwater's operations in the territory had been suspended, and Judge Crawford was awaiting trial for corruption and conspiracy. Grace had decided to sell her father's ranch once it was officially returned to her, a decision that had come with both grief and relief. The memories there were too painful, too tainted by violence. Instead, she and Hank had expanded his homestead, adding 2 new rooms to the cabin and increasing their horse herd with breeding stock purchased from a rancher heading to California. As Hank finished with the colt and walked toward the cabin, Grace felt the now familiar warmth that his presence always brought. He had become her anchor, her partner in all things, and in 2 weeks' time, they would make it official when the circuit preacher came through. That colt's coming along nicely, Grace commented as Hank climbed the porch steps. He'll fetch a good price in the spring. If you're willing to sell him, Hank teased, knowing she had a tendency to grow attached to the horses they trained. Grace laughed, leaning into him as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I'm getting better about that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The beauty of the moment wasn't lost on Grace, who had once thought she might never see another sunset. Any regrets? Hank asked quietly, seeming to follow her thoughts. About selling your father's place, I mean. Grace considered the question seriously. No, she finally said. He would understand. The land was important to him, but family more so. She turned in Hank's embrace to look up at him. This is where I belong now. This is home. Hank's eyes, gray as the winter sky, softened with emotion. I never thought I'd hear anyone say that about this place, he admitted. Never thought I'd want to hear it. Well, get used to it, Grace replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him lightly. Because I plan on saying it for many years to come. As darkness fell, they moved inside to the warmth of their cabin. Grace felt the familiar wave of exhaustion that had been her constant companion lately, a side effect the doctor in town had confirmed last week of the child growing within her. They hadn't told anyone yet, wanting to keep the joy to themselves a little longer. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Grace's eyes grew too heavy to keep open despite her desire to savor the moment. Hank noticed, of course. He always did. Sleep, the cowboy said softly, pulling her closer against him. I'll still be here when you wake. Grace smiled as she drifted off, secure in the knowledge that the promise made in desperation months ago had become the foundation of their life together, a life neither of them had expected to find, but both now couldn't imagine living without.